TIAA is on a mission. Why? Because 54% of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So in collaboration with big-name artists like Wyclef Jean, TIAA released Paper Right, new music inspiring a new financial future. With 100% of streaming sales going to a nonprofit that teaches students how to invest. Stream Paper Right now and help close the gap.
The Waco History Podcast is sponsored by Brotherwell Brewery on historic Bridge Street in Waco.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio.
All right, welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. I've got a great guest with me today, Dr. John Dennis Anderson. He is a performance studies scholar and associate professor emeritus of communication studies from Emerson College. He performs nationally his one-person shows on authors such as Henry James, William Faulkner, Washington Irving, Ernest Hemingway, Robert Frost, and others. There's a lot of things that I could talk to him about with regard to performance and performance studies. But here we're delving back into Dr. Anderson's past to explore some work he did many years ago on Waco legend Madison Cooper. And so he did interviews, he did research, he's written, scripted a couple of plays on Madison Cooper. And so we're here to learn a little bit more. If you did not hear the episode on Sironia that Jim Sorrell did for us, that's going to carry a lot of the weight on talking about Sironia. But Madison Cooper had a very rich and interesting life. And so Dr. Anderson's going to help us with that. So thank you for coming in today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. I'd love to get just a little bit of a kind of a background of how you came to this work. I mean, this is many years ago as you get your doctorate at UT, but you got 2 degrees from Baylor as well. And so I think it's during that time at Baylor that this introduction comes to you.
Exactly. I am from Waco, was born here and grew up here. And I went off to Texas Tech for a year and a half before I transferred to Baylor. And I was primarily a debater on the Baylor debate team until my senior year as an undergrad. And under the influence of a wonderful professor named Charles McGeever, I started focusing on oral interpretation. And in my senior year as an undergraduate, I was in a production that was directed by Danny Volek about William Cooper Brann, and got really interested in Waco history. And incidentally, that production about Brann included in the cast Kirk Watson, who's now the mayor of Austin. So I decided to continue with a master's immediately after my undergrad degree, and I had to come up with a project. Initially, I intended it to be a thesis project, but it became just an MA project because I ended up deciding I was going to go right into my PhD at UT. So I just did a couple of extra courses and didn't do the actual thesis, but I did do the production, an adaptation of Sironia, Texas. So learning about Brann, I started learning more about Waco history, and I'd vaguely known about the novel Sironia, Texas. I had also worked in the Waco Public Library, starting in junior high as a volunteer. And for a year and a half, I was a part-time reference librarian in the evenings. And I remember always being able to look from the reference desk out the window and see the cupola of the Cooper Mansion. And so when I finally actually looked at the novel, I was just blown away. It was amazing to me. And so in 1,731 pages in 2 volumes, it's a daunting prospect to adapt it. But I was lucky to find a short story called The Catch of Sironia that Cooper published in 1939, I think. He started working on the novel. It took him 11 years to write it. And it was published in 1952. So this was very early in his work on the story of Sironia. So The Catch of Sironia was a short story that pretty much tracked the story of Lance Thaxton and Tam Lipscomb's connection to him. And so that enabled me to go back to the novel and just track those episodes that made a short story. So it's easier to adapt a short story into a play than a novel. And then I added 2 other subplots to sort of round it out. So I was working on adapting it, and I was taking courses in the history department as a minor in my master's. I took a wonderful oral history seminar with Dr. Tom Charlton, and for that, we did research. We did an oral history interview as our project. And I had been working in the Texas collection with the Madison Cooper papers. Kent Keith was the archivist. He was very helpful at helping me navigate those papers. And the letters that he kept were really interesting, and I used those a lot for the production. And sorry if I'm making noise here, adjusting my microphone, my headphones. I found this notebook that Cooper had kept that he devoted a page to each of the major characters. There are 80, well, all the characters, there are 83 major characters in the novel. And so each page was about one character, and he would tell, he identified the people he based the characters on. And they were usually composites. So one character in the novel would be a composite of as many as 6 real people. And he would list 2 columns, who they looked like, and in the other column, who they acted like as a child, as an adolescent, and as an adult, for the characters that, are children at the beginning of the novel. It covers the years 1900 to 1921. And the main character is named Tam Lipscomb. And so I wrote down all these names, and then I started asking around, who these people were. And one of the characters in the novel is Trina Starro Hayden, who is described as very plain and colorless, but very sweet. And she marries the sort of scapegrace of the aristocratic families, Jed Hayden. And I thought, well, if there's any character in this novel which has a lot of scandal in it, who wouldn't mind being identified with a character, it would be this very sweet woman. And so under that page for Trina Starro Hayden, he had listed that she acts like Florrie Neal Cooper H. And the Cooper caught my attention because I thought, oh, maybe this is a relative. And in the correspondence, he kept all of his fan mail, which is really fun to read. And,
I bet, yeah. And
somebody said, are you related to Florrie Neal Cooper Hudson? So I knew the last name. And he said, no. But I just went to the phone book. And I still remember the night that I was in my office, my graduate student office at Castellaw Communications Center, and I called this phone number. She lived at 4200 Grimm, and when she answered the phone, it was like a character stepping out of the book. I got chills. And she had this very thick Southern accent that was just gorgeous to listen to. And she had known Cooper slightly. They went to the same Episcopal church, but she'd never read the novel. She had been told that it was a dirty book and that it was not respectable to read. And so I told her, well, you're identified in his notes as the basis for a character. And her, she got really interested then. And so I asked if I could interview her as my oral history project. So on 2 occasions, I interviewed her in April and May of 1978. And I recorded those on those old reel-to-reel tape recorders. And it was a fascinating experience. And basically, first I did the standard oral history interview, who are your parents, what's your education, et cetera. And then I spent most of, it ended up being about 4 hours of interviews, asking her about, character after character and specific situation in the novel. And it would trigger memories for her of schools she attended, childhood friends, men she dated, and parties she would have attended, and what the decorations were like, what the refreshments were like, what the dances they danced were. So
she had a really good memory.
She did. It was really amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she would occasionally blank on something, but and she would free associate. Something would remind her of something, and so I did that interview in 1978, and got an A in my oral history seminar.
Fantastic. That's the most important thing here.
Yeah. And then I put it aside. I suspect that the reason I still had the tape as opposed to turning it into Dr. Charlton was that I was planning at that time to finish a thesis. And so he probably let me keep it because I was going to be working for a few more months on it. And then for whatever reason, I decided to go right into UT that next fall. And so I took an extra course that summer and wrote up a project paper instead of a thesis. And so it got left in my hands, and I've carried it around all these years thinking I've got to do something with this. In fact, I had intended to give it to the oral history collection at some point. But I wanted to listen to it, and finally this summer I had it digitized, sent it off to a place near Boston, and started listening to it, and it was amazing. There are a lot of things I'd forgotten, obviously, because that was almost 40 years ago now.
Yeah.
So in the last couple of weeks, I've listened to more of it, and I appreciate even more how many of the people that we talked about are gone now. I mean, just in developing my work on Madison Cooper, Dr. Charles McGeever has passed away, Kent Keith has passed away, Jerome Cartwright, who was the director of the Cooper Foundation, who was very helpful. He even let me take some of the furniture out of the house and use it for the set.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, the production was done at the Waco Civic Theater rather than at a theater at Baylor, because I had grown up being in plays at the Waco Civic Theater, and I wanted to do it in that particular space. And Henry Snyder, who was the director of the theater, let me do this. I adapted and directed, and even had to play one role as a kind of understudy for somebody who wasn't able to do one of the 3 weekends of the show. And of course, Mrs. Hudson is gone. So it's kind of a time capsule now to have this interview and to look back on this project. And as I said, I went right into my PhD in Austin as soon as the production was over, or a few months after that. And at first I sort of pitched the idea of writing a PhD dissertation on Sironia, Texas, and my graduate advisor at UT said no. And I ended up writing about Faulkner and Virginia Woolf and a couple of other writers instead. But it was always in the back of my mind to come back to this. And in 1985, 7 years after the first production, I was asked to revive the production by the Cooper Foundation as a fundraiser to raise money to renovate the Cooper Mansion. And so they let me do it again. And I had to get permission from the Cooper Foundation and from Houghton Mifflin, who was the Boston publisher who published the novel. And So I did it again in 1985, and it was a more elaborate production that time.
Where did you stage that production?
Also at the Waco Civic Theater.
Okay.
And Baylor Theater contributed costumes. The style of the play was chamber theater, so it was a staging of a narrative work with the narrative still intact. So I used Madison Cooper as the primary narrator in both productions. And in the second production, I distributed the narration among the characters. I had seen Nicholas Nickleby on Broadway, this huge, expansive adaptation of a Dickens novel that used an ensemble narration. And so I think that 1985 production was much better as a result. And I did stick very closely to the novel, adapting the novel with the narration intact. I did add a few monologues for Madison Cooper, one in each act, and they were compiled from interviews and letters that were in the Texas collection at Baylor. And then over the years, every time I thought about going back to that play, I thought, well, the deciding factor was the representation of race in the novel and in my play as a result is something I'm uncomfortable with now in a way I was kind of naive about, clueless about in 1978 and 1985. The N-word is used a lot in the novel, and I had it in my play as well. So I finally decided that I don't feel comfortable putting that script on the stage again without changing it drastically. But I was still interested in Cooper himself. And so I started working on a one-man play about Cooper about the time I retired from teaching at Emerson in 2016. I had been doing these what are called Chautauqua performances starting in 93, 94, as writers that included, as you mentioned in the introduction, Henry James and William Faulkner. And so when I first started the solo play about Madison Cooper, it was a little like a Chautauqua, which is an interactive humanities program where scholars impersonate historical figures, giving a monologue in character and in costume for about 30 minutes to 45 minutes, and then taking questions from the audience in character and then out of character as a scholar. And so they're kind of like biographical lectures, or as if a historical author were giving a public reading and a lecture. And over time, as I would show it to people, and I did several staged readings of it up in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where I live now, and people would give me feedback that they'd like to see something more dramatic and less lecture-like and less filled with details about Cooper's life in the novel. And so it's evolved, and now it has 4 characters in it in the latest iteration, and I'm continuing to work on it. It was inspiring to attend the dedication of the historical marker for the Jesse Washington lynching last Sunday, because a major episode in the novel is a lynching very similar to the Jesse Washington lynching, which happened in 1916. And I include an account of that in the novel and talk about its relationship to the historical event. And so I was very moved to see the dedication of that memorial. So there's still some difficult material about race in the play, even the Madison Cooper play, as opposed to the adaptation of the novel. And in the latest iteration of the play, I had actually included a character who was lobbying to get a historical marker placed. And I wrote it before I knew that the language had actually been drafted. I think the last public reading of this was done in July, not long after I learned that they'd already drafted the language for the historical marker, and I kept waiting for it to actually be installed.
Yeah, we had language for it in 2016, so that's how long the effort has gone on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating project, and I still am obsessed with.
So that has not been staged locally. That iteration of. Yeah,
no.
Okay.
I'd love to have a chance to do it.
Yeah, well, that gives me an idea. We'll talk about that later. So I'm interested, John. You did historical research. You talked to contemporaries. You did creative works, and then you tried to embody Madison Cooper over time. So if you could kind of introduce him to us, you don't have to do this, first person, but if you could introduce us a little bit to, as you've come to know him, who was he, and what did you find interesting? Why did his kind of story stick with you, you think?
Well, growing up in Waco, it was a real revelation to me to learn of somebody who had written a best-selling novel in 1952 that was the longest novel ever published at the time. And it was inspiring to see that somebody with a background like mine could achieve something of that magnitude. Even though, oddly, it felt like it had been forgotten. And so that became a kind of mission of mine, was to resurrect this forgotten novel. And Cooper himself was born in 1894. He was from a fairly privileged family, but not an old, established family. His father made his fortune with the Cooper Grocery Company. And one of the major themes of the novel is the conflict between old original families. They called them the Hill families in Sironia, Texas, which is very similar to Waco, although he denied that it was Waco, but I think that might have been to avoid liability.
Yeah. As we said before, he didn't really know any other place.
There you go.
Yeah.
So he grew up in Waco with a family that was self-made as opposed to inherited wealth. And even the old Hill families had fallen on bad times, and they were not as wealthy as they had been, but they still believed themselves as influential as they ever had been. And so that's one of the major conflicts. In fact, one of the working titles for the novel was The Hackberry and the Magnolia, with the hackberry representing the sort of more middle-class background of the main character, Tam Lipscomb, and the magnolia representing the old Southern aristocrats, the Hill families. And so I think he is portraying some of his own experience growing up with money in a society that still privileged old families, multi-generational families of influence. And then the racial themes in the novel are very prominent. I highly recommend Jim Sorrell's discussion of this in the previous podcast, which I only discovered a few weeks ago, even though it was made back in November, I think. Cooper was something of a sociologist, I think, as well as a novelist. And I understand he'd written some kind of work of sociology that he threw away, abandoned. I'd be curious to know what that was about. Oh, another person who was so helpful in this process was Marion Travis, who wrote a biography of Cooper published by Word Books. And I contacted her during my research, and she gave me an annotated copy of her book where she would write all the things that she wasn't able to include in the book. And she also alerted me to people, well, the book talks about people theories about who the characters are based on.
Mm-hmm.
When the novel was published in 1952, it was kind of a scandal
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of sexuality in the book. There's a lot of miscegenation and murders and suicides and, the famous reservation in Waco,
Mm-hmm.
the red light district figures in the novel. Peyton Place hadn't been written yet, but it was sort of Waco's Peyton Place.
Mm-hmm.
Like Mrs. Hudson said, it was considered a dirty book, and she wouldn't have been caught reading it, at the time, although she devoured it once I told her she was the basis for a character. So the novel is very rich. It's the style is a little awkward, kind of like Dreiser. As I have lived with the novel over these years, I've come to the conclusion that he might have been influenced by William Faulkner, particularly the novels Light in August and Absalom, Absalom, because one of the major characters of the novel, like Joe Christmas in Light in August, is a man who is both black and white. He's sort of caught between the worlds of black and white populations and feels a lot of conflict as a result, and then ultimately gets lynched. Although the character, it's his brother who gets lynched in Sironia, Texas. And then Absalom, Absalom is about interracial sexual relationships and even incest. And doing all the work I did on Faulkner for Chautauqua Performance, I was able to then go back and look again at Sironia and appreciate some of the influences that I think Cooper was operating with. And one of the real sort of keys to the whole thing for me was a letter that I found in the archives at the Texas Collection that Cooper had written to Malcolm Cowley, who was a major literary critic of the 40s and 50s. Cowley had been responsible basically for resurrecting Faulkner's career when Faulkner had gone out of print basically and was struggling. He had to go to Hollywood to write movies in order to write screenplays in order to pay the bills. His books were out of print. And Cowley, who also was very interested in Hemingway and other writers of the Lost Generation, published The Portable Faulkner, which is an anthology of Faulkner's work that sort of put Faulkner back on the map, and he won the Nobel a few years after that. And so I can't help but think that Cooper thought that Cowley might be able to do the same thing for him. And he wrote this letter that I found very poignant. It's a page and a half, single space. It's a fairly long letter. And he kept the carbon of it, and that's why we have it in the Texas Collection. And he's basically saying, when the novel came out, the publishers were taking a big risk. They were spending a lot of money. He was an unknown novelist, first novel. It was incredibly long, and so he felt obliged to do as much publicity for it as he could. And it was announced in April, I think, of 1952 that the novel was going to be published. And media from everywhere descended on Waco. And he was in Life magazine and Vogue magazine, and photographers came to Waco. And then the novel didn't actually get published until November. So from April to November, all of this excitement has kind of started to die down. And then when it was published, it was widely reviewed. But, and it was, I think, respectably reviewed. It was reviewed by Granville Hicks, another major critic, on the front page of the New York Times Book Review, a full-page review that continued elsewhere in the issue. And then it was 11 weeks on the bestseller list, and then it kind of dropped out of sight. Interestingly, in the Cooper papers at the Texas Collection, you can see the efforts he was making to be considered for the Pulitzer Prize. He wrote letters to everybody on the Pulitzer Committee with a packet of reviews. He was sort of campaigning. But the Pulitzer went that year to Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea.
Yeah.
And it was the same year that Edna Ferber's Giant was published, and the same year that John Steinbeck's East of Eden was published. So he had a lot of stiff competition. So he really wanted to get the novel taken seriously as more than just a publicity stunt, more than just, this Texas-sized longest novel ever published. And he wrote this letter to Cowley because Cowley had, in a volume of literary criticism, had mentioned Sironia kind of in passing as an example of post-war naturalism, along with William Styron and Carson McCullers. And so inspired by that, Cooper wrote Malcolm Cowley saying, thank you for, what you've said about the book. And, can you help me get it looked at again?
Mm.
This was in 1954.
Okay.
2 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's just the letter he sent to Cowley in the Texas collection. Well, I discovered that there are Malcolm Cowley papers in Chicago at a university collection. And so I found the online catalog of all those papers, and there's a folder with Madison Cooper's name on it, meaning that there's a correspondence between them. So I called the library, the Peabody Library, and asked them, could you look in that folder and tell me if there's more than this one letter? And they did. And there's only the one letter that Cooper wrote Cowley.
No response.
Cowley never responded.
Mm-hmm.
And so I suspect, Cooper did go on to write another novel, The Haunted Hacienda.
I wanted to ask you about that because it was a trilogy, right? He was planning a trilogy.
He was, and it's set in West Texas, not in, sort of Central Texas, cotton country. And I don't think he knew West Texas as well. But I don't really care much for The Haunted Hacienda, I'm sorry to say. And he died in September of 1956 before he could complete this trilogy. And so he left instructions that all of his personal papers, including his drafts of the rest of the trilogy, be destroyed. And his assistant was R.B. Hoover, who later became the first director of the Cooper Foundation. And Cooper took several station wagon loads of papers to the incinerator.
Hoover took?
Hoover.
Yeah, Hoover took, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we will never know how the rest of the trilogy was supposed to turn out. I guess he had learned that the length of Sironia, Texas was kind of a problem for getting people to finish it. And so he decided to break up the trilogy that would have started with Haunted Hacienda. Interestingly, he wanted a movie made of Sironia, Texas. And in the Cooper papers at the Texas collection, there's an outline that he made, about 2 long pages, legal-sized pages, of 6 separate feature films that he would let the novel be broken into. And he even had ideas about casting, who he wanted to play the characters. He wanted Mildred Natwick to play Millie Thaxton. And he did get some offers, but he didn't think they were willing to pay enough. And so he held out, and then interest died out. If he had played his cards right, it could have been Bigger Than Giant, or Raintree County, which was another long regional novel about Indiana that Houghton Mifflin had published as well. So was there more to your question?
Well, that was really what I, trying to get a sense of also kind of Cooper, the man, just, he was, as you said, a bit of a sociologist, and I hear him described as, reclusive, maybe increasingly reclusive in his life, or really an observer of people, and maybe just other ways in which you kind of learned who he was as an individual.
Yeah. Well, everybody talks about his eccentricities.
Mm-hmm.
He was very well-to-do,
Mm-hmm.
but he lived very modestly. He wore old clothes. There's a funny story. His nephew's secretary was a woman named Mildred Rast, or Pud Rast. Pud was her nickname. And my father, who was an accountant in Waco, knew Pud Rast, and he said, "Would you like for me to ask Pud Rast if she'll, let you interview her?" So I did have a phone conversation with her, and she told this story of Cooper coming to her office, and she would throw away used carbons, and he would dig them out of the trash rather than pay for a fresh carbon paper. And so that Malcolm Cowley letter is on carbon in the Texas collection. He kept, carbon copies of everything and he had an extensive correspondence. So he was a penny pincher,
Mm-hmm.
notorious for wearing old clothes. And Pud Rast said she wrote him a note because she was embarrassed and said, "You have a hole in your pants." And he, as he was leaving the office, it's a bank, he leaned over and whispered to her, if you ever have a hole in your pants, I'll let you know." So he had a sense of humor.
Uh-huh.
He owned a movie theater in Waco. One of the things I did in my research recently is I learned that there were photographs at the Library of Congress from the photographer who came to Waco to take all these pictures. Some of them were published in Vogue, I think, but there were contact sheets of dozens of other shots, and I was able to order the contact sheets, and there's some pictures of him at the box office of his theater.
Oh, interesting.
I'm trying to remember if it was the Waco Theater. I'm not sure. So he was very interested in theater and film,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know that recluse is the right word. He liked to walk everywhere rather than take the streetcar. This is one of the things that Flora Cooper Hudson thought was unusual about him. It's funny, when I was interviewing her, I asked her towards the end of this 4 hours of interview what she thought of Cooper, knowing him casually from church.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "Well, I really don't want to say." And I, pressed a little more, and she said, "Well, turn that machine off." So I turned off the tape recorder, and then it comes back on, and we're sort of laughing, and she's talking about how he was kind of she doesn't use the word rude, but he was very individualistic. And,
I see.
I mean, she's struggling. She's saying he's hard to describe. But she didn't like him very much, is the implication. He was not a likable person. He was a kind of abrasive, I gather, and conceited. In his letters, there's a line that I use in the play about, "Dear God of Sironia," the letter was addressed from a woman who had known him slightly, saying, "Well, now you have reason to be conceited." And he said, "Well, I thought I'd always had reason." He got into a legal battle with the Cooper Grocery Company's co-partner, the Milams, that resulted in the sort of dissolution, well, not the dissolution, but Cooper being removed from the company. And there was some bitterness about that. He didn't get along with his sister, Lucille Cooper Lacey.
Mm-hmm.
And she actually lived right behind the Cooper house. And one of her sons, Lawrence Lacey, in the oral history interview that I found in the online Oral History Institute collection. He talks about there were times when some of his younger brothers and sisters were born, and they would farm him out to the grandparents and Uncle Madison. And so he lived in the house that's now the Cooper Foundation, which is an amazing house.
Mm-hmm.
I got to use, for my production, I got to take things out of the office and use them to dress the stage.
Oh, wow.
The center of the set was a recreation of his office. It's not the open-air cupola that some people think that he wrote the novel in. It's the attic room right below that.
Okay.
So now I've lost my train of thought.
You were talking about Lawrence Lacey
Lawrence.
living in the house. Yeah.
Living in the house and talking about, Cooper often wouldn't come home for dinner. He talks fondly of Bertha Walton, the African-American housekeeper who started working for the Cooper family when Cooper's parents were still alive. And then they died in the early 40s, and she stayed on living above the garage. And she was still alive in 1978 when I did my production. And Marion Travis, the biographer, had gotten to know her and asked her if she would talk to me. And Bertha didn't choose to talk to me, which I really am sorry I wasn't able to do. And actually, only when I started this more recent research did I realize that she had died in 1985, just a few months after the second production that I did. I've actually visited her grave, which is in Oakwood Cemetery, not far actually from Madison Cooper's grave. Of course, his has this very elaborate, more than life-size angel on it. Hers is a very simple tombstone. In the recent play I've been writing, I imagine her great niece in the present day being interviewed about her great aunt, and so it was moving to find the actual grave and the obituary. Just recently, I've been able to identify a great niece, a real great niece, not the fictional one that I had created, who lives in Dallas, that I'm hoping now to get in touch with. I only learned about this Monday.
Okay. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
That's
wonderful. So the research continues.
Well, you were telling me Sunday about Mrs. Hudson's reaction to her, how she was depicted. So once she read the Dirty Book and saw how she was depicted, how did she react to that?
Well, the character she is based on, who's based on her, Trina Starro Hayden, dies at the end of the first quarter of the novel. The novel's in 2 volumes, but each of the 2 volumes have books 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So she dies at the end of book 1, and she hadn't quite gotten to that yet. She said she was obviously not long for this world. So she didn't read the whole novel yet. I assume she probably went on to read it, but she had been a great beauty. She was the queen of the 1917 Cotton Palace. And I had forgotten to tell her before she started reading. The first interview was conducted before she read the novel. I gave her a copy of it to read then. And then the second interview, about a month later, was after she had seen my production and read the first quarter of the novel. And I had forgotten to tell her that he divided up how a character looks and how a character acts, and that she was the basis for the sweet personality of the character and not her plain appearance. And so when I met her the second time after she had been reading the novel, she immediately showed me a picture of herself as the queen of the 1917 Cotton Palace and said, "See, I didn't look like a stalk of celery," as he described somebody saying about Trina Starro Hayden. And I had to sort of fall all over myself apologizing for not having been clearer. And she had a good sense of humor after that. And I think she said, at first, Trina struck her as kind of bland and colorless, but as that first part of the novel progressed, she said she started to show characteristics that she wouldn't mind being associated with. So she was mollified. There's another interesting tangent that I alluded to when we met, which was that, there's a lot of sex in the novel. And there's a lot about adolescent boys and their curiosity about sex and how they learn about sex and their first sexual experiences. And in reading the oral history interviews online, who was it? I think it was Abner McCall's wife mentioned a sex education class that Madison Cooper, who was a friend of hers, had paid for. And all of a sudden I remembered, I only read that comment in the last couple of years, but back when I was doing the research in 1978, I had talked to the director of the Armstrong Browning Library, Lois Murray Strain. My sister was a tour guide in the Browning Library at that time, or had been rather. And so she said to me, Lois Murray Strain says she has things to say about Cooper. Why don't you talk to her? And in this conversation with Mrs. Strain, who was also a Dr. Strain, she was an English professor at Baylor. She mentioned that Cooper, or it was her husband, had told her that Cooper had the biggest pornography collection in Waco. And I remember being really startled to hear that sort of coming out of nowhere. But then the pieces all began to fit when I learned years later that he had paid for sex education classes at Waco High School. And Lois Murray Strain taught the girls' half of the sex education class. So that's why she knew about the pornography collection. But that also, again, this interest in sociology, this interest in philanthropy and making Waco a better, more desirable place to live, which is the stated purpose of the Cooper Foundation, which he created in honor of his parents after they died. It's part of that pattern of him studying human behavior and wanting to improve the world. In this letter to Malcolm Cowley, he said, Sironia, Texas is a truly honest book, and it is ultimately a study in tolerance and, I hope, compassion. And you don't get that impression from all the publicity and the reviews, which talk about the length of the novel and the sort of melodramatic qualities of it, that he did have a serious purpose in the book. And he wanted, he was extremely ambitious, obviously. And, I think he felt he was deserving of the Pulitzer Prize, not just having written a best-selling novel. And that makes him more interesting to me, and kind of poignant, actually, that he didn't quite achieve, as much as he did achieve. He didn't quite get what he wanted, and that makes him a compelling, dramatic character too. So that's why I continue to be interested in it.
Well, it's been a career-long sort of unpacking, I guess, of who he was. And as you said, thinking about it again as circumstances change and looking at him in the 1970s context and looking at him now and trying to understand who he was. Yeah.
Actually, if we have time, there's a little bit in a review by Granville Hicks in the New York Times that I found very illuminating. And when I went back and looked at it, it struck me as more significant than it had back in 1978. It goes back to this issue of the Black characters in the novel are very stereotypical, as Jim Sorrell talked about. There's a character, Mammy Henderson, who seems straight out of Gone with the Wind. But ultimately, most of the important Black characters are her grandchildren, children and grandchildren. And they become very complex and multifaceted characters, not just stereotypes. And one of them ultimately is who gets lynched. One of them, well, I don't want to give away too much of the novel, but
hey, you gave them plenty of time to read it.
But Granville Hicks addresses this issue in his review. He says the Black characters seem very stereotypical, and then he says, repeatedly, Mr. Cooper seems to accept Southern prejudices, only to set forth incidents or situations that expose the fallacies on which they rest. In other words, these characters become more complex than just the stereotypes that you first assume they represent. And in the next paragraph, he says, it's just possible that Mr. Cooper's reticences and apparent inconsistencies are part of a deliberate strategy. But it seems more likely that they grow out of a conflict between the ideas he was brought up with and his deeper perceptions. If this is true, the great thing is that his perceptions haven't been censored. He has set down what he has seen and felt, whether it fitted his theories or not. And I want to believe that he was more conscious of that than Granville Hicks seems to be willing to give him credit for. And that's sort of how I write him in my play. I try to be as close to the documentary record as possible, but I inevitably and over time have become more and more willing to sort of take a leap of interpretation with him. And so I try to, well, and that line in the letter to Malcolm Cowley about having a serious purpose, and the book is ultimately a study in tolerance and I hope compassion. I think he means, tolerance for racial differences and discrimination, and compassion for people who were discriminated against and what it results in.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I'm hoping we can get your latest production here in town. So we'll see if we can get to work. On that.
Great.
We can get you back to Waco. I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. I think we ought to end with, you mentioned a clip that you thought you might want to share from your oral history interview that we began the conversation by talking about. If you don't mind introducing that clip, and then we'll share it with listeners.
Well, I just wanted listeners to hear Mrs. Hudson's voice and how charming she is. And I'll try to find one that gives you a little bit of her sense of humor.
All right, we'll listen to that now.
For instance, his grooming was all right. He was always just as clean and immaculate as could be, but he didn't have any style. And he just wasn't the kind of a person that the girls fought over at all. He just, well, I really don't know how to describe it, but so far as having a date with him, I wouldn't have been the least bit thrilled to have a date with him. In fact, I don't know if I would have given him one or not, because just dull, boring. But his mind was so superior to mine that I'm sure I just couldn't appreciate what he had or what he had to offer. And I guess it comes out in this manuscript, this book that he's written.
Well, I want to thank you so much, John, for being with us today and sharing about your research. I appreciate you reaching out. I think it was Jim's podcast that helped you connect to him and him connect you to me. So thanks for sitting down with me today.
And thank you for doing this series. It's fascinating. I really have loved being able to listen to these.
Great.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. This has been a Rogue Media Network production.